I was on watch duty the night the colony went dark. That's not a figure of speech. I mean, the lights literally died. Every single power node across Ferris Station blinked out at 03:14 local time, one after another, like someone walking down a corridor and flipping switches. First the outer ring, then the processing towers, then the med bay, then the central hub, and finally the emergency grid, which was supposed to be hardened against exactly this kind of cascading failure. Supposed to be. My name is Corporal Dara Osai, formerly of the 9th Colonial Defense Auxiliary, and I'm going to tell you what happened on Ferris Station. Not the version that got released in the official summary. Not the cleaned-up timeline that the UEC Foreign Relations Office put out 3 weeks after the fact. I'm going to tell you what I actually saw, what I actually heard, what it smelled like when the walls were burning, and what it felt like to be completely, totally certain that nobody was coming. Because that's the thing they don't put in the official summaries. That feeling of certainty, that absolute bone-deep knowledge that you are alone, that the signal you sent has gone nowhere, that the universe is big and you are small, and no one is going to arrive in time. I want to talk about that feeling, because what happened after, what came after that feeling, that's the whole story. That's the reason I'm sitting here telling it. Ferris Station was a third-tier colonial settlement on the outer edge of the Cathara Reach, orbiting a dim red dwarf called Ferris 7. The star put out just enough warmth to make the planet marginally habitable if you had the right atmospheric processors running around the clock. We had 4 of those processors. They were the size of small office buildings. They were also the first things that stopped working that night. The colony had been established 11 years ago by the Vantran Cooperative, which was one of the smaller colonial development companies operating in the Reach. They'd picked Ferris 7 because the mineral surveys looked promising, particularly the deep-crust vanadium deposits that fed into Starship fuel synthesis. The idea was to build a small but profitable extraction operation, run it for 20 years, and retire the claim. It didn't quite work out that way. By the time I arrived as part of a 6-person auxiliary security team, Ferris Station had grown from the original crew of 40 into a genuine community of about 2,300 people. Families had come. Children had been born here. There was a school, 2 medical clinics, a small market district that had developed organically in what used to be a storage bay, and a cultural center that hosted movie nights on Fridays and something called the Ferris Station Annual Harvest Celebration, which was basically an excuse to eat too much and argue about the previous year's sports results. It was, in other words, a home. Not a military base, not a fortress, not a place that had any particular reason to expect what was coming. We had the auxiliary team, 6 of us, and a set of 3 automated defense platforms that were rated for light deterrence, meaning they were good for keeping away minor opportunists, but not designed for sustained engagement. We had a communication array that could bounce signals to the nearest relay station, which was 11 light towers away. And we had a local magistrate named Counselor Yeva Strandqvist, who was 63 years old, and had been managing this station for the last 7 years, and who had, I can tell you from personal experience, absolutely no tolerance for drama. Counselor Strandqvist had seen the first atmospheric processor go offline at 02:50. She'd been awake and in the operations center because she'd been monitoring a pressure anomaly in the northern extraction field, something that happened once every few months and usually resolved itself by morning. When the first processor went offline, she assumed it was a maintenance fault. When the second went offline 9 minutes later, she called me. I was in the bunk room, not quite asleep. The call came through on my personal comm, and I answered it before the second chime finished. "Osai," she said, and her voice was the kind of calm that you only learn after decades of dealing with crises, not the calm of someone who isn't worried. The calm of someone who has decided that worrying won't help right now. Get dressed, get your team up, meet me in ops. What's happening, Counselor? A brief pause, then, I'm not sure yet, that's what I need your help figuring out. I woke the team. Martinez first, because she was the fastest out of bed and the most immediately useful in an ambiguous situation. Then Croft, Ngozi, Park, and finally Vasquez, who slept like a man who had made a personal agreement with unconsciousness and didn't appreciate having it violated. We were in ops within 4 minutes. By then, the third processor had gone offline. The operations center at Ferris Station was a squat, hexagonal room at the center of the main hub, lined with display panels on 5 of the 6 walls, and a large central table that projected a live map of the station and the surrounding area. It smelled like recycled air and hot electronics, and the particular kind of coffee that Counselor Strandqvist drank exclusively, dark, bitter, and thick enough to stand a spoon in. She was standing at the central table when we came in, her silver-streaked hair still loose from sleep, wearing a pressure suit liner and holding a tablet. 3 of her technical staff were at stations around the perimeter, talking quietly and pulling up diagnostic feeds. Processors 2, 3, and 4 are all showing the same failure mode, she said without looking up. Not a power fault, not a mechanical failure. The control software has been overwritten. Martinez, who was our team's technical specialist, moved to the nearest panel and started pulling up the code signatures. Overwritten with what? That's still unclear. Whatever it is, it's thorough. The failsafes, the redundant controls, the manual override protocols, all compromised. Strandqvist finally looked up. Her eyes were tired but sharp. Someone prepared this. There was a short silence. Someone or something, Ngozi said. He was the oldest member of our team, a retired fleet warrant officer who'd seen the edges of space and didn't spook easily. But I noticed his jaw tighten. We all knew what he was thinking. The Cathara Reach had been contested space for 3 years. Not openly hostile, the Galactic Cooperative of Sovereign Species, which was the mouthful of a name for the interstellar coalition that currently had territorial claims overlapping with parts of the Reach, hadn't made any formal moves. But there had been incidents. A UEC survey vessel that went silent near the outer Cathara and turned up 6 months later with its crew gone and its records wiped. 2 mining platforms that had been found drifting with no power and no explanation. A signal intercept that the fleet intelligence people had classified immediately and refused to discuss publicly. Ferris Station was technically within contested territory. Everyone knew it. Nobody talked about it much, because talking about it didn't make the vanadium seems less valuable or the houses less comfortable. I'm going to send a distress signal, Counselor Strandqvist said. Full emergency broadcast, all channels. I want UEC Defense Command and every other authority with jurisdiction in the Reach to know our situation within the next 10 minutes. And then, I asked. She looked at me with those tired, sharp eyes. And then we wait, and we defend ourselves as best we can with what we have, and we hope the signal gets to someone who can respond in time. I want to be honest about what that meant. The nearest UEC defense installation was at Cathara Prime, which was 19 light hours away. A distress signal would take 19 hours to arrive. A response, if one was immediately dispatched, would take days. At standard transit speeds, we were looking at 4 to 6 days minimum before any military response could reach us. We didn't have 4 to 6 days. We had, as it turned out, about 18 hours. The Galactic Cooperative's advance elements arrived at 09:40 the next morning local time. I say arrived, but what they actually did was materialize. One moment the space around Ferris Station was empty. The next, there were 7 ships in close orbit, not UEC ships, not anything in our recognition databases. They were long and segmented, built on a geometry that made your eyes slide off them slightly, like your brain couldn't quite settle on their proportions. Their hulls were a deep, non-reflective gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and they moved in a way that felt subtly wrong, like watching footage with certain frames missing. We'd identified them from the station's external sensors before they did anything else. 7 ships. The largest was approximately 300 meters from bow to stern. It was, to put it simply, several times larger than anything our 3 automated defense platforms could meaningfully engage. Then they opened a broadcast channel. The translation came through our systems with about a 4-second delay. The cooperative's signal was in a layered compression format that our software had to work to unpack. When it came through, it was in standard, accented strangely, but clear enough to understand. Attention inhabitants of Ferris Station. You are occupying territory that falls within the sovereign domain of the Galactic Cooperative of Sovereign Species under the Cathara Reach Territorial Consolidation Act, passed in the 3rd session of the Cooperative Assembly, Galactic Standard Year 11,847. You are requested to begin immediate preparations for station transfer. All inhabitants will be given 48 hours to gather personal belongings before relocation to a cooperative-administered transit hub. Resistance to this process will result in measures that we strongly advise you to avoid. Counselor Strandqvist listened to this message 3 times. Then she sent a reply. This is Counselor Yeva Strandqvist of Ferris Station, operating under a UEC colonial charter granted in GSY 11836. We are a civilian settlement of 2,300 residents, including children. We have sent a distress signal to UEC Defense Command and request that all further contact be conducted through proper diplomatic channels. We do not recognize the authority of the Kethara Reach Territorial Consolidation Act, as it was passed without the knowledge or consent of any human diplomatic entity. We will not be relocating our residents. There was a pause of about 20 minutes. Then the cooperative responded. Counselor Strandqvist, your distress signal has been noted. We are also aware that the nearest UEC defense installation requires a minimum of 4 standard days to dispatch and transit any response force. You have sent a message into an empty room. We advise you to reconsider your position. I'm not going to lie to you. When I heard that, something cold settled into my stomach and stayed there. Because they were right. They were absolutely right. We had sent a message into an empty room. There was no guarantee that anyone had even received it yet. And even if they had, the math was brutal and simple and not in our favor. We had 6 security personnel and 3 light defense platforms. They had 7 ships and an unknown number of whatever they were using for ground forces. And they had already neutralized our life support infrastructure, which meant that even if we could hold them off militarily, we were on a timer. Without the atmospheric processors, the station's internal oxygen recyclers could sustain 2,300 people for roughly 72 hours before conditions became critical. I had a conversation with Martinez in the corridor outside Ops that I still think about sometimes. She said, "You think anyone's coming?" I said, "I don't know." She nodded, "What do you think we should do?" I thought about it for a long moment. I think we do our jobs. I think we make it as hard as possible for them to do what they're trying to do, and we hold out as long as we can, and we hope. She looked at me with this expression that was somewhere between exhausted and honest. That's not much of a plan. No, I agreed, it's not. What I didn't say, because I didn't have the words for it right then, was this. There's a particular kind of dignity in refusing to accept defeat even when defeat is the rational assessment. It's not denial. It's not stupidity. It's something closer to the belief that the rational assessment might be wrong, that the universe occasionally does something that contradicts the math, and that the only way to find out is to still be standing when it happens. I held on to that thought for the next 16 hours. The cooperative landed their first ground elements at 14:00. They used small atmospheric insertion craft, flattened ovoids about 20 meters long that came down in tight formation near the station's outer perimeter. Our defense platforms engaged them immediately, tracking and firing with the competent automation they were designed for. 2 of the insertion craft took direct hits and peeled away from the formation, trailing debris. A third lost propulsion and came down hard about 400 meters from the outer fence. But 4 others made it through and set down without taking significant damage. From those 4 craft came approximately 60 soldiers. I say soldiers because that's the best human word for them, but they weren't human. They were Vareth, the cooperative's primary enforcement species, roughly bipedal, standing a bit over 2 meters, with a bilateral symmetry that was familiar enough but a body plan that was clearly adapted for a heavier gravity than Earth's. Their armor was articulated, intelligent, shifting in configuration as they moved, and it contained its own life support system. They were heavily armed. 60 of them against 6 of us. I had stopped doing the math by this point because the math was not helpful. What we did have was knowledge of the station's layout, which they didn't. We had the trust of the colonists, which mattered enormously, because the colonists didn't run, didn't panic, didn't try to surrender against our advice. They went to the safe zones we'd established in the inner residential modules, they stayed calm, and they did what they were told. That kind of trust is not a military asset in the traditional sense, but it's something. It means you're fighting for something that's still there. We fought a delaying action. That's the honest description. We used the station's architecture, The long corridors, the maintenance crawlways, the tight choke points between modules to slow the Varath advance, to make them take each section by section rather than sweeping through in a single push. Martinez was extraordinary. She knew the station's electrical systems well enough to improvise hazards, not lethal ones, because we were trying to preserve the infrastructure we'd need to survive, but disorienting ones. Locked doors that shouldn't be locked. Lighting shifts that disrupted their sensor gear. A section of the processing corridor that she managed to fog with steam from a ruptured coolant line, which bought us about 40 minutes of confusion. Ngozi got hit in the upper arm at 1622. The shot clipped him and took out most of his left shoulder plating, and he went down hard, but he got back up, and he kept fighting, and he didn't complain about it even once. Vasquez, who we'd always teased about his fondness for sleep, turned out to be genuinely ferocious in a close corridor with a magnetic accelerator rifle. I don't know how to explain it except that some people rise to match the situation they're in, and Vasquez was one of those people. Croft was our communications specialist, and she stayed at the secondary relay we'd set up in the inner hub, maintaining the broadcast, updating the distress signal with our situation in real time. Every hour she sent a fresh burst, our status, the cooperative ship configuration, the composition and disposition of their ground forces, whatever she could observe. All of it going out on all channels, in every direction, over and over. Into the empty room. At 19:00 local time, the cooperative sent another message. Counselor Strandqvist, your defense personnel have been skilled and have earned our professional respect. However, your position is tactically untenable. You have lost 2 of your 3 automated platforms. Your team is taking casualties. Your life support degradation continues. We offer the following terms: cease resistance now, and all inhabitants of Ferris Station will be transported safely to a cooperative transit facility within 72 hours. This offer expires at 20:00 local time. I was standing next to Strandqvist when she received this. She read it twice, very slowly, and then she set down her tablet with a precise, deliberate motion. "What would you do?" she asked me. I knew what she was asking. She was a civilian administrator. She was responsible for 2,300 lives. She was asking me, the person who was supposed to understand tactical situations, whether holding out was still rational. I was quiet for about 10 seconds. Their offer doesn't include returning control of this station to us, I said. It doesn't include any guarantee of when or whether the people who go to that transit facility will be allowed to come home. The cooperative's transit facilities in the Reach have been used as indefinite holding locations before. We know this. Yes, she said. And if we accept their terms, this station, this home, becomes cooperative territory. The vanadium mines, the community, the school, all of it. It stops being human space. Yes, she said again. I looked at her directly. Then I think we hold out. She nodded once, slowly. Then she straightened and she picked up her tablet and she sent the cooperative the following response. Our answer is no, we will not be relocating. This is our home and we intend to keep it. Part 2, the Sky OPENS. The next few hours were the hardest. Not because the fighting got worse exactly, though it did get worse, but because the emotional weight of what we were doing finally settled in. We weren't just defending a position anymore. We were making a choice, again and again in the dark, with no sign that anyone was coming, that these people and this place were worth fighting for even when fighting looked like losing. That kind of choice cost something. I'm not sure how to quantify it, except to say that every hour past midnight felt longer than the one before. By 22:00, the cooperative's ground forces had taken the outer ring of modules. That was the processing facilities, the maintenance bays, the external storage. Not the residential areas, not the medical clinic, not the school, we still held those. But the outer ring was gone, and with it went the last of our physical perimeter. The 3 of us who were still fully mobile, me, Martinez, and Vasquez, pulled back to the inner hub. Ngozi, Croft, and Park were there already, Ngozi being treated by one of the station's medics, Croft still transmitting, Park managing the few remaining automated systems we had left to work with. We gathered in the small room adjacent to the medical bay where Counselor Strandqvist had set up her command position. She was still there, still drinking that terrible coffee, still calm. I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall because there weren't enough chairs, and I rested my rifle across my knees, and I tried to think clearly. The honest assessment at 22:00 on the night of the cooperative's arrival was this: we had held for 12 hours. We had caused significantly more difficulty than they had anticipated. We had taken no fatalities among the colonists. We had lost one automated defense platform and taken it out of action ourselves before abandoning it to prevent them from using it against us. We were battered but functional. We also had no realistic expectation of reinforcement. The distress signal had been going out for 19 hours. It had traveled 19 light hours in all directions. Whatever was within that bubble had heard it. Whatever was outside that bubble hadn't. The nearest UEC defense asset we knew of at Cathara Prime was still 19 light hours away. Even if they had dispatched immediately upon receiving our signal, which would require someone to have been monitoring the distress bands at the exact right moment, which was not guaranteed, they were 4 days out at minimum. 4 days? We didn't have 4 days. I thought about calling it. I thought about going to Counselor Strandqvist and telling her that the rational decision was to open negotiations, to try to get the best possible terms for the colonists, to stop the bleeding. I thought about Vasquez, who hadn't complained once. About Croft, transmitting into the void with the same steady dedication as if she knew someone was receiving. About Ngozi, who was letting the medic work on his shoulder while simultaneously keeping one eye on a tactical display. I thought about the little kid I'd seen in the market district the week before, maybe 7 years old, trying to carry a bag of fruit that was clearly too heavy for her and absolutely refusing to ask for help. I decided not to call it. We hold, I said, to nobody in particular. Nobody disagreed. At 01:47 in the morning, which was now the second full day since the cooperative had arrived, something changed. Croft noticed it first. She'd been monitoring the communications environment with half her attention while she maintained our transmissions, and she was good at it in the way that people become good at things they've been doing continuously for many hours. She caught the anomaly before any of our automated systems flagged it. "Osai," she said, and something in her voice made me cross the room immediately. She was pointing at a secondary display showing the electromagnetic environment around the station, specifically showing signal activity in the upper frequency bands. There was a pattern in the noise. Not random background interference, a pattern. Compressed, encrypted, cycling through frequency bands in a rotation that I'd never seen used by the cooperative or anyone else in the Reach. "Is that ours?" I asked. "It's not theirs," she said, "and it's not any natural emission source I know of." She was working her panel, trying to crack the encryption, her fingers moving with the particular focused speed of someone who has found something and doesn't want to lose it. "It's tight beam, very directional, aimed at the station from..." She paused, recalibrated, looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "From above." "From the cooperative ships." "No," she shook her head. "Wrong angle, wrong signature. This is coming from much higher orbit, from something that's not on our sensors." A beat of silence. "Osai, there's something out there that we can't see." I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite hope. I was too tired and too beaten up for clean hope. More like the very first edge of the possibility of hope. "Can you get into it?" I asked. "Give me 4 minutes." She got into it in 3. The message was short. It was in military compressed standard, and it was exactly 9 words long. "Ferris Station, we have you. Hold your position, coming." I remember reading those words 3 times. I remember that my hands were shaking slightly, which surprised me, because I'd managed not to shake through 12 hours of firefights and bad math and worse odds. I remember Croft looking at me with an expression that was equal parts disbelief, and something fierce and bright that I didn't have a name for. "Who is it?" Martinez asked from across the room. Croft looked at her signal analysis. "The encryption signature is UEC Defense Fleet, deep black." A pause. "Special Operations Protocols." There was a silence in the room that had a texture to it. "How far out?" Vasquez asked. Croft shook her head. "I can't tell. The signal is very tight, but it's coming from above our current orbital zone, which means..." She trailed off. "Which means they're already here," I said. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Ngozi, from his position on the medical bay floor with his left arm in a temporary immobilizer, said in a voice that was remarkably steady for a man who'd been shot 6 hours ago. "I told you. I always told you. You send the signal, you hold out, someone comes." We held our position for another 93 minutes. I won't pretend those 93 minutes were easy. The Cooperative's ground forces had begun a slow push toward the inner hub, and we were at the absolute edge of our ability to resist it. We were running low on ammunition, running low on energy reserves for the systems we still controlled, running low on the particular kind of stubborn determination that had been keeping us upright. What we weren't running low on was the knowledge that someone was coming. That knowledge changes everything. I can't explain it precisely, it's not rational exactly. The tactical situation was identical to what it had been before we received that signal. Our numbers hadn't changed. The Cooperative's numbers hadn't changed. Nothing physical had shifted. But knowing that someone was coming, knowing that those 9 words were real and not a hallucination, knowing that we had been heard. It is very difficult to explain what that does to a person who has spent 16 hours believing they're alone. I stopped doing the math about odds and started doing the math about time. How long could we hold? How long would they need? Could we make the 2 numbers meet? We fought differently in those 93 minutes. Smarter, more economical. Every shot placed with more care, every position chosen for maximum defensive value. We weren't trying to win anymore, just to last, and there's a particular freedom in that simplification. At 03:20 local time on the second day of the Cooperative's presence at Ferris Station, the sky above us changed. I didn't see it directly, of course. We were inside the station, inside the inner hub, behind several layers of module wall. But Croft had managed to maintain a feed from one of the external optical sensors that the Cooperative hadn't fully deactivated, a small unit mounted on the upper curve of the central hub's roof. The feed was grainy and the angle was awkward, but it showed the sky. And at 03:20, the sky above Ferris Station opened. Not literally. I mean that something came through the upper atmosphere at a speed and trajectory that created a visual effect. A series of contrails, white-hot at their leading edges, cutting down through the darkness like lines drawn by something enormous and fast and absolutely certain of where it was going. Not 1, not 2. 11 distinct entry signatures. 11. I counted them twice because the first count seemed wrong. 11 high-speed insertion tracks, coming down in a pattern that bracketed the station on all sides, not just approaching from one direction, but surrounding, encompassing, arriving from multiple angles simultaneously in the kind of coordinated ballet that takes months of training and extremely precise timing to execute. Croft was making sounds next to me that weren't quite words. Martinez had grabbed my arm without seeming to realize she'd done it. "What is that?" Vasquez asked quietly. "That," I said, and my voice came out strange and unsteady, "is the cavalry." The Cooperative's command ship recognized what was happening before we did. Their communications erupted immediately. We could hear the burst transmissions even without cracking the encryption, just in the sudden shift in signal density and urgency. Then one of the Cooperative ships broke orbit. Just one initially, the smallest of the 7, a scout-class vessel that lit its drives and began pulling away from the station. Then a second ship started powering its drives. On our sensor feed, we watched the 11 incoming tracks resolve into shapes as they dropped through the lower atmosphere. They weren't conventional ships. They were too fast for that, too maneuverable. They were something closer to what you'd get if you crossed a missile with a fighter and gave it the structural integrity of something much larger. They were assault landers, human assault landers specifically. The UEC Deep Reach Rapid Response Corps used a class of insertion vehicle called a Spear, officially designated the AT-9 atmospheric transit vehicle, that had been designed for exactly this kind of scenario, getting combat personnel to a surface objective through a contested orbital environment at maximum speed, prioritizing velocity and surprise over conventional comfort or elegance. 11 Spears. Each Spear could carry 40 personnel in combat configuration. That was 440 soldiers coming down from the sky at speeds that made normal atmospheric entry look leisurely. The Cooperative had not known they were there. I want to be clear about that because it matters enormously. 7 cooperative ships in orbit, and none of them had detected the DRRC response force until they were already committed to entry. Whatever the DRRC had used to mask their approach, and I later learned some of it, though not all of it, because some of it is still classified, it had worked. The cooperative's first awareness of the human response force was the moment the spears lit their atmospheric braking systems and made themselves unavoidable. That's not an accident, that's not luck. That's planning. That's an organization that received a distress signal and said, they need time, so let's move, and let's move in a way that gives them the most possible advantage. The 2 cooperative ships that had begun powering their drives were still in the process of maneuvering when the spears completed their descent. The first one touched down at 03:24, 4 minutes after I'd first seen them on the optical feed. Part 3, What Came Down. I want to describe what it was like inside the station when the DRRC hit the ground, because I was there, and because I think the accounts I've read since then don't quite get it right. There's a sound that comes through the walls of a pressurized station module when something very large and very fast makes contact with the ground nearby. It's not quite an impact. It's more like the station itself taking a breath. A sudden pressure differential that you feel in your eardrums and your chest simultaneously. And then almost immediately after, there's a vibration. Not violent, not damaging. Just a steady, purposeful vibration that tells your body something significant is happening outside. We felt 11 of those impacts in about 45 seconds. The colonists in the safe zones, who had been quiet and scared for 16 hours, heard those impacts. And somehow, I think because silence had been the sound of the enemy and this was something different, something loud and assertive and coming from outside rather than inside, they didn't panic. A few of them cheered. I heard it through the corridor walls, this ragged, disorganized sound of human relief. Then the DRRC announced themselves. Their channel came through on our emergency frequency, secure, authenticated, using the right codes, and the voice was calm and professional and carried the particular clipped efficiency of someone who is very busy and very focused. Ferris Station Defense, this is Lieutenant Colonel Amara Yusuf, DRRC 7th Battalion. We are on the ground. Initiate your current defensive assignments and fall back to the medical module. Confirm. Croft nearly knocked over her console, getting to the transmitter. Confirmed, Colonel. Ferris Station Defense, 6 personnel, 1 injured. We're at the inner hub, medical module adjacent. We've been holding the cooperative ground forces at 2 choke points in the outer hub ring. Understood. Those positions are now ours. Your job is done. Get your people clear. Your job is done. I'm going to tell you something embarrassing. When I heard those words, I had to stand still for a moment and consciously remind myself to keep breathing, because there was a physiological response to them that I was not expecting and not in control of. Not crying, exactly, there wasn't time for that, and I'm not sure I had anything left in reserve to cry with anyway. More like a release of pressure, like a structural member that has been holding more than it was designed for and is, finally being relieved of the load. I relayed the order to the team. Fall back to medical, stay clear of the outer corridor they're coming through. We heard the DRRC come through the outer ring. I don't mean we heard gunfire and confusion. I mean we heard something organized and overwhelming and efficient. The Vareth ground forces, 60 soldiers who had been advancing through the station in controlled, professional fashion, encountered the DRRC 7th Battalion at the outer hub junction, and the sound of that encounter was brief. Very brief. I learned later what had happened in detail, from the after-action reports that became public about 6 weeks later, and from conversations with some of the DRRC personnel over the following days. I'll tell you what I learned, but even now it's something I find difficult to describe in a way that does it justice. The DRRC 7th Battalion was 440 people. They were the product of a specific type of training that UEC Defense Command had developed in the years since the Cathara Reach situation had begun to escalate. A program designed to produce personnel who could operate in contested space, in unfamiliar environments, with incomplete information, against adversaries with significant technological advantages. It was called the Deep Reach Combat Adaptation Program, and its graduates were identified by a particular insignia on their shoulder. A circle bisected by a diagonal line, which looked almost like a targeting reticle and was, as far as I've been told, entirely intentional. These were not ordinary soldiers. I don't mean that in a mythological sense. I mean it in a practical one. They had been selected and trained and equipped for exactly this category of situation. They knew how to move through unfamiliar station architecture quickly. They knew how to deal with the Cooperative's Varath troops, whose capabilities and tactics they had studied extensively. They knew how to work in the reduced visibility and chaotic sensor environment that comes with a station that's running on emergency power. And they had just come down from the sky after a classified approach that had kept them invisible to 7 cooperative ships. The Varath ground force, for all their professionalism, had been operating for 16 hours in an environment where they had been fighting a 6-person auxiliary unit. They had adapted to that. They had calibrated their tactics, their pace, their expectations to what a 6-person auxiliary unit was capable of doing to them. They were not calibrated for the DRRC. The contact at the outer hub junction lasted 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, the Cooperative's 60 ground troops had been neutralized, not killed, I should be clear, because the DRRC were operating under rules of engagement that prioritized capture and extraction over lethality where possible. It was a tactical choice with diplomatic implications that I only fully understood later. But neutralized, contained, done. I met Lieutenant Colonel Yusuf about 40 minutes after they came through the outer ring. She came to the medical module in person, which I later understood was deliberate. She wanted to see the status of the people she'd been sent to help, and she wanted to do it herself rather than receiving a report. She was shorter than I expected, based on the voice. I'd built an image in my head during those initial radio exchanges, and the reality was different, though not in any way that mattered. She was maybe 45, dark-skinned, with close-cropped gray at her temples, and the kind of posture that has been trained into someone's bones. She shook hands with each of us. Real handshakes, not the formal touch and release. She held each one for a moment and looked at the person directly. When she got to me, she said, "Corporal, I've read your team's action log." Real-time as Specialist Croft was transmitting it. She paused. "That's going to be studied in training programs, what you did here." I didn't know what to say to that. I think I said something adequately incoherent and left it at that. She moved to where Counselor Strandqvist was sitting, and they had a conversation that I wasn't close enough to hear fully. I caught fragments, words like diplomatic situation and immediate priorities and extraction option. At one point, Strandqvist said something that made Yusuf stop and be quiet for a moment, and then Yusuf nodded. Later, I asked Strandqvist what she'd told her. "I told her that we were not leaving," Strandqvist said. "I told her that this is our home, that the people who live here built it and intended to keep it, and that whatever the Cooperative's territorial claims, we intended to remain until those claims were resolved through diplomatic channels. I told her that if the DRRC was here to facilitate an evacuation, we appreciated the thought but would decline." "What did she say?" Strandqvist picked up her tablet. She said, "That's why we came prepared to stay." Part 4, the work after. What happened in the weeks after the DRRC's arrival is complicated, and I'm not going to pretend I understand all of it. What I understand is the part I witnessed. The orbital situation resolved faster than anyone expected. The 7 cooperative ships had not left when the spears came down. 2 had begun maneuvering, as I mentioned, but they hadn't completed it before the DRRC was on the ground. And once the DRRC was on the ground with 440 combat personnel and the Cooperative's ground forces were contained, the strategic equation changed significantly. The Cooperative's tactical advantage had been the certainty that no response could arrive in time. That certainty was now demonstrably false. Their ships were still in orbit, which gave them strategic options, but those options came with complications. Opening fire on a station with 2,300 civilians and 440 UEC military personnel would be an act of war, formal, undeniable, recorded. The Cooperative was many things, but they were sophisticated enough to know what that meant. More importantly, they hadn't expected this. The Varath ground commander, whose name I later learned was something that doesn't translate well into standard, was apparently a precise, methodical individual who had executed dozens of territorial consolidations in the Reach over the past several years. He was good at his job. He operated within a framework of assumptions about how human colonial settlements would respond to cooperative pressure, and those assumptions had been largely validated by previous experience. He had not, apparently, factored in the specific personality of Yeva Strandqvist, or the existence of the DRRC, or the possibility that a 6-person auxiliary unit would hold a contested station for 16 hours while transmitting real-time tactical data that allowed an incoming force to plan their insertion with extraordinary precision. The cooperative entered formal diplomatic communication with UEC Defense Command within 6 hours of the DRRC's arrival. Within 48 hours, they had withdrawn their ships from the immediate orbital zone around Ferris Station. Within 2 weeks, the Cathara Reach Territorial Consolidation Act was being formally contested at the Galactic Assembly, with 3 other species who had their own concerns about cooperative territorial methodology joining the UEC's objection. I'm not a diplomat. I can't tell you how that process ended or where it currently stands. What I can tell you is that when I left Ferris Station 3 weeks after the cooperative's arrival, the station was still there, the colonists were still there, the school was still running, the market district was back in operation, and the atmospheric processors had been repaired and returned to full function. Part 5, What I Carry. I'm going to tell you about one more moment. The day before I left Ferris Station, I was walking the outer ring, the section that the cooperative had held for about 12 hours, that the DRRC had taken back in 11 minutes. The repair teams had been through it. Most of the surface damage was already fixed or sealed. The corridors were clean. The lights were on. I stopped in front of a section of wall in the processing module where, during the fighting, someone, one of ours, one of theirs, I genuinely don't know, had put a scorch mark about the size of a dinner plate, high up near the ceiling. The repair team hadn't gotten to it yet. It was dark and irregular against the pale gray of the module wall, and I stood there looking at it for a while. A little girl came around the corner. The one I'd seen in the market district the week before, the one with the too heavy bag of fruit. She was with her father, who was part of the engineering team working on restoring the section. He was carrying tools. She was carrying a small container of something, helping him the way children help, which is to say that she was mostly not helping but was present and involved and happy about it. She stopped when she saw me, because I was in uniform and I was standing in the middle of the corridor staring at the ceiling. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "That mark," I said, "up there." She looked, she considered it with the thoroughness that children bring to considering things. "It's a burn mark." "Yes." "From the fighting." "Yes." She thought about this. "Why are you looking at it?" I wasn't sure how to answer that. I tried anyway, because I want to remember what it cost, what staying here cost, and what it was worth. She looked at the mark again, then back at me. Her expression was the expression of a 7-year-old who has decided that an adult's answer was more complicated than the question warranted, but who is prepared to be polite about it. "Mama says it cost a lot," she said, "but she says it was ours to keep, so it was worth it." She went back to following her father down the corridor. I watched them go. "Mama says it was ours to keep, so it was worth it." I've been asked, in various debrief settings and in the months since returning to active rotation, what I think the lesson of Ferris Station is. What do we take from it? What should be different going forward? I have a few things I could say about doctrine, about response times and prepositioned assets and communication protocols, about the value of real-time intelligence transmitted by personnel in contact, about the specific capabilities of the DRRC and the role of training programs designed for contested space scenarios. All of those are true, all of those matter. Smarter people than me are incorporating them into the relevant frameworks. But when I'm honest about what I carry from Ferris Station, what actually changed in my understanding of things, it's simpler and harder to make into a policy recommendation. It's this: the empty room sometimes has someone in it. Not always, not reliably, not in a way you can bank on as a strategy. The math on Ferris Station was genuinely terrible. We were genuinely alone for most of those 16 hours. The message we sent could have arrived and been triaged and been assigned a low priority given the distance and the competing demands on Defense Command's resources. The DRRC could have been deployed somewhere else. The timing could have been a few hours different, and the outcome would have looked very different. But it wasn't. And the only reason we were still there to be found when the DRRC arrived, was that we hadn't accepted the math. We decided that the math might be wrong. We'd held the position not because the position was defensible by any objective measure, but because it was ours, and because the people in it deserved to have someone stand between them and the thing that was coming for them. There is a kind of stubbornness that isn't stupidity. There is a kind of hope that isn't naivety. There is a kind of human refusal that doesn't compute in the models the cooperative was using, and I genuinely believe, that that refusal is part of why the math worked out the way it did. Because we were still transmitting when the DRRC was in range to receive a useful signal. Because Croft was still at her station, still maintaining the broadcast, still updating the tactical picture in real time. Because that information made the difference between an insertion that succeeded and one that might not have. The empty room sometimes has someone in it, but only if you're still talking when they arrive. Epilogue, Aftermath, and Record. This account was composed by Corporal Dara Osai, 9th Colonial Defense Auxiliary, approximately 6 weeks after the events described, at the request of the UEC Defense Auxiliary Historical Documentation Unit. It reflects personal observation and recollection, and should be read alongside the official after-action reports for completeness. The following is a matter of public record. Ferris Station remained in operation under its existing UEC colonial charter, following the resolution of the immediate territorial dispute. The Cathara Reach Territorial Consolidation Act was successfully contested at the Galactic Assembly, with the judgment ultimately finding that unilateral territorial consolidation without notification of affected parties violated the Assembly's own charter obligations. The cooperative did not return to Ferris Station. All 6 members of the Ferris Station Auxiliary Security Team survived the engagement. Warrant Officer 3rd Class Tobias Ngozi required reconstructive surgery for the left shoulder injury sustained on day 1 of the engagement and returned to active duty approximately 4 months after the events. All 6 received the UEC Colonial Defense Commendation. Lieutenant Colonel Amara Yusuf and the DRRC 7th Battalion returned to classified deployment status approximately 3 weeks after the Ferris Station action. The details of their insertion approach and the technology used to maintain signal invisibility against cooperative orbital sensors remain classified. Counselor Yeva Strankvist declined several offers of career advancement within the UEC Colonial Administration and remained at Ferris Station. She is, as of this writing, still there. The atmospheric processors at Ferris Station have been upgraded and are currently operating at 112% of their original design capacity. The little girl in the processing corridor was named Myra Halst. Her father, Engineer First Class Darren Halst, was one of the people who repaired the atmospheric processors following the engagement. The burn mark on the wall of the processing module was eventually painted over. But for about a week, someone nobody admitted to it had put a small flower drawn in marker beneath it. Just an outline, simple, a few lines. It was gone when the repair team got to that section. I like to think it was her,